I open my email under a blistering sun, sweat dripping onto the cracked screen. Notice a final divorce decree. It read a 13 years ended in a PDF. No warning, no voice, just Becky's signature. Notarized and dated 2 weeks ago. I was still in Kandahar. She was already engaged to a man I'd never met, but his name would unravel everything. Subscribe so you don't miss what's next. Becky and I married right before my second deployment. She was calm, steady, the kind of woman my mom called a good anchor. We bought a modest home near Fort Bliss. Becky handled everything: bills, taxes, the real estate agent. Daniel Spencer said he was her cousin. I didn't question it. Back then, deployments blurred details, but I do remember the first time a credit alert popped up. She said it was a clerical mix-up. The second red flag came a year later. I came home on leave to find our spare room converted: filing cabinets, 2 laptops, stacks of unopened mail. Becky said she was starting a remote admin gig, said it helped pay for my mom's medical bills. She smiled, touched my hand. I wanted to believe her. Wilson joked it looked like she was running the IRS from our house. I laughed. Back then, everything still felt safe. When my unit got reassigned stateside, I noticed our accounts weren't sysning. Becky blamed the military credit union's new system. But the paperwork didn't lie: 3 maxed out cards I never used. I asked about it. She teared up. Said it was medical debt from my mom's hospice care. It felt wrong, but I dropped it. Wilson noticed me pacing barracks halls. You good? He asked. I wasn't. But I didn't know what to call it yet. Becky stopped visiting base events, claimed gas was too expensive, said she'd be embarrassed around the other wives. I bought it, until Murphy showed me Becky's Instagram: new nails, dinners, weekend trips. Not alone either. A guy named Jeremy kept appearing in her photos. Just her cousin, she insisted. I remember Daniel, another cousin. I asked Wilson, is it paranoid if it's pattern? He didn't laugh. That silence was the first confirmation I wasn't imagining things. I requested bank statements through our GAG office. 2 joint accounts had been emptied in under 2 months. Charges flagged in Texas, Arizona, even Nevada, places I wouldn't step foot in. Becky said it was identity theft, blamed phishing emails, but when James Callahan, my old unit buddy turned lawyer, checked into it, the emails traced back to our home IP. That's when I stopped asking. I started documenting, because suspicion was finally turning into something else. I left a voice recorder in the hallway during her weekly phone calls. Didn't tell anyone, not even Wilson. What I caught was muffled but clear enough: Jeremy talking about moving funds and clearing the last batch. Becky laughed. It wasn't guilt, it was comfort. I played the tape for James. He leaned back, folded his arms. You sure you want to go further? I nodded. For 13 years I protected her. Now I had to protect myself. James advised getting the FBI involved. Said cross-state fraud wasn't small time. Agent Patel took my first statement. She didn't flinch when I showed the financial maps I'd built color-coded. Detailed, she said I weren't the first military spouse reporting strange divorces, fast financial clinates. I sat in my truck afterward, numb. Wilson handed me a soda. You good? Same question this time, I said. Not yet. That felt like the closest thing to honesty in weeks. The last night before deployment, Becky came by unannounced. No warning, no bags. She just stood there, all smiles, acting like nothing had changed. Don't leave, mad, she whispered. She touched my chest. Just like old times. I didn't move. She left lipstick on my collar. Wilson walked in minutes later. Was that her? I nodded. You let her in? Yeah, I said. But in my mind, that door had already closed a long time ago. In Kandahar, news spread slow, but emails didn't lie. Divorce finalized, home sold, my name scrubbed from deeds. I stared at the screen in our unit tent, the sandstorm outside a quiet war. Murphy leaned over my shoulder. They did what? I didn't answer. The documents were real. Notarized, witnessed, done. Agent Donovan emailed. Next we found 3 more cases, similar pattern. All military spouses, one common link: Daniel Spencer. I slammed the laptop shut. Game on. Agent Patel looped me into a virtual briefing. The ring targeted deployed soldiers' wives, filed fast-track divorces, liquidated assets, remarried or disappeared. Jeremy Ryan wasn't just Becky's boyfriend, he was a known alias. Daniel Spencer was no cousin. He was listed as a witness on 7 divorces. The call ended. But I sat frozen. I wasn't a husband betrayed. I was a mark, a variable in someone else's spreadsheet, and now I had to break their formula. With Murphy's help, I tracked every shared login, every digital breadcrumb. The utility bills were still in Becky's maiden name, but one ISP was registered to Margaret Ryan in El Paso. Patel verified alias. I traced cell tower pings to a ranch house west of town. James coordinated with local law enforcement. Surveillance was greenlit. I weren't supposed to be involved. But I had one edge: they'd underestimated me, and that kind of arrogance leaves gaps. The night of the stakeout, I watched from a borrowed surveillance van. Becky emerged, arm in arm with Jeremy. Laughing carefree, she wore the necklace I gave her after Afghanistan. I almost broke then. But the door opened and Daniel walked out, holding a briefcase. Patel whispered through the earpiece, "That's him." My hands clenched. Wilson gripped my shoulder. "You're doing the right thing," he said. I didn't feel like it, but justice doesn't wait on feelings. Becky met Jeremy's eyes as he handed her a tablet. She typed quickly. Agent Donovan signaled they were transferring funds. We had minutes. Officers surrounded the property. Lights flashed. Chaos. Becky screamed Jeremy's name. He ran. Daniel bolted through the backs. I stayed seated, watching. Wilson said, "Go." But this wasn't a movie. This was real. My war wasn't in a desert anymore. It was here, with wires, screens, and the woman I once thought I loved. Inside, agents cuffed Jeremy and Daniel. Becky sat on the couch, wrists bare, staring at the empty driveway. "Nathan," she said softly, as if that name still had weight. I didn't answer. Patel read her rights. I turned to leave. Wilson followed. Outside, I lit a cigarette, first in years. James texted, "You okay?" I typed, then deleted 3 replies. Finally, it's done. But the truth that was just the end of their part in it. Back at base, Command reviewed everything. They issued a full investigation across military legal support networks. Turns out, over 24 soldiers had similar cases, different names, same method. Patel called it the spouse sweep. I sat in a dark room for hours, reading affidavits. It wasn't just fraud, it was warfare, psychological, targeted, and cruel. Murphy muttered, "They preyed on loyalty." I nodded. That was the worst part. They used love like a weapon and it worked. Wilson and I returned to our barracks to find 2 new soldiers waiting, fresh out of basic. I watched them unpack, photos taped to walls, letters tucked in drawers. That used to be me. Wide-eyed and broken, I handed one a tip about locker setup. He thanked me like I mattered. "You're Briggs, right? Heard about what you did." I forced a nod. Heroes wear medals. I wore scars hidden under a uniform and silence I had earned. At night, I rewatched the interrogation footage. Becky never cried. Not once. Jeremy pled ignorance. Daniel clammed up. But Becky, she corrected timelines, clarified spreadsheets, like a manager walking through logistics. Patel whispered, "She doesn't feel remorse. She feels superior." I remembered our wedding. Her tears then, real or rehearsed. Wilson said, "You still love her?" I didn't answer, because the truth was messier than that. I didn't love her. I mourned the man who did. The FBI uncovered a hidden property in New Mexico, land registered under Becky's maiden name. The mortgage was paid off in full. 2 months before our divorce, Patel sent aerial photos, a 2-story cabin, solar panels, satellite internet, luxury in the middle of nowhere. They were going to disappear, she said. James nodded. Retirement plan built on stolen lives. I stared at the screen. A part of me wondered how close had they come to getting away clean. One victim's spouse had gone missing 6 months earlier. FBI never linked it until now. Daniel had filed a spousal abandonment motion days after the wife disappeared. Her family never stopped looking. When shown Daniel's photo, the sister confirmed it. He had shown up at their house once, claiming to be a financial advisor. The timeline matched. Patel whispered, "This just changed categories, from fraud to something darker." Wilson said nothing, just clenched his jaw and nodded. Jeremy's laptop had a hidden drive, encrypted, but not invincible. FBI forensics cracked it in 3 days. Inside, files labeled by base name, soldier ID numbers, financial logs, and emotional notes like red wine. Cries when yelled at. Patel showed me one. "Mine obeys authority," it read, "avoids conflict." I felt sick. "This isn't just theft," she said. "It's behavioral targeting. They studied us like prey." Wilson muttered. "They didn't break you." I wasn't sure that was true. One folder was titled Failsafe. It held videos, Becky rehearsing courtroom tears, Jeremy faking confusion in staged Zoom calls. Worst was Daniel instructing a woman how to forge signatures. Patel hit pause. "They prepped for fallout," James whispered. "Contingency plans." The cruelty wasn't spontaneous. It was process, blueprinted. I stared at Becky's face, her crocodile tears on loop. Somewhere in that footage, the woman I married died. Or maybe she never existed. Just another role in the scam. Becky cut a deal. She'd testify against Daniel and Jeremy in exchange for reduced time. Patel was furious. She orchestrated half of it. But the prosecution wanted airtight convictions. In court, Becky wore a navy dress, hair pinned back. She spoke in calm practice tones. But when she looked at me just once, it wasn't remorse. I thought it was calculation. Like she was still keeping score. Wilson whispered, "She thinks she won." I whispered back, "Not yet." Becky's testimony backfired. Under cross, James exposed inconsistencies. Dates didn't match. One timeline placed her in 2 cities on the same day. Clerical error. She claimed, but the judge wasn't buying it. The Daw's expression soured. Later, Patel smirked. She overplayed it. Becky had lied so often she couldn't remember her own script. Jeremy's lawyer moved to separate trials. Daniel's team blamed Becky entirely. The unity crumbled. Watching them turn on each other was bitter justice. In a private FBI debrief, Patel revealed something Becky hadn't mentioned: an offshore account linked to a shell company in Belize. It had been active for over 5 years. Thousands moved monthly. This predates your divorce, she said, which meant the con began long before Kandahar, maybe even before our wedding. Was I ever real to her? I asked. Patel didn't answer, just handed me the file. The truth was in there, cold, numeric, undeniable. I traced that shell company's origin to an old contact address, my childhood home. The fraud's foundation used my own identity as its cornerstone. She built it off you, James said. My social, my discharge papers, even my mom's maiden name were tied to bank forms. I felt violated in a way war never touched. Wilson read the form and muttered. She used every piece of you. He was wrong, not every piece, just the trusting ones. A letter arrived from Becky, typed impersonal. She claimed she never meant to hurt me, said Jeremy took control. A lie dressed as closure. I handed it to Patel. Can we use this? She smiled. It contradicts her testimony. Court resumed the next week. James introduced the letter as new evidence. Becky's lawyer objected, denied. The judge read it aloud. Her voice faltered. For once, I saw real fear in Becky's eyes. That was the crack I needed. Daniel's brother came forward, an estranged sibling. Tired of secrets, he had kept a thumb drive, fearing retribution. It held voice memos: Daniel coaching Becky on manipulating legal staff, Jeremy laughing about ghosting soldiers mid-deployment. Patel's team verified timestamps. The drive sealed it. Charges expanded to include racketeering and conspiracy. Wilson whispered, "That's the nail." I nodded. Watching them sit in court, silent and cornered, I felt something close to peace, not victory, just the first step toward it. Murphy found a photo from our old deployment, Becky at a base family day, smiling beside Jeremy, dated 3 years before I even knew the man. How long was this going on? I muttered. Wilson said, "Long enough." Patel added it to evidence. Becky had lied under oath again. The DA filed a perjury charge. Watching the jury hear it, I realized something. I wasn't chasing justice anymore. I was watching it take root. That felt new. During trial recess, one juror passed me a note, just one line: "We see it." It wasn't protocol, probably grounds for dismissal, but it stayed folded in my palm all day. When testimony resumed, Becky's composure cracked. Patel cross-examined ruthlessly. "How many lies do you recall today?" she asked. Becky stammered. The courtroom was silent. James whispered, "She's unraveling." That night, I didn't sleep, not from nerves, from something else. Hope, maybe. A feeling I'd forgotten existed. Jeremy's defense collapsed fast. Evidence showed him wiring funds to fake charities and dummy nonprofits. But the kicker? He bought stolen military aids from a dark-int vendor. His username matched logs found on Becky's devices. James presented both in tandem. Even Jeremy's lawyer looked disgusted. The judge added identity theft charges. Patel leaned back, arms crossed. "They never thought we'd trace it." I nodded. Greed makes people sloppy, and their greed was as big as their downfall. Becky's lawyer made a last-ditch motion to suppress audio from my recorder. Claimed privacy violations. The judge asked if she'd been aware it was recorded. Becky said no. Patel countered with texts. "Did you delete that call last week?" From Jeremy. "Already wiped." "Nathan's dumb," she'd replied. Judge allowed the tape. Becky went pale. For the first time, her confidence cracked wide open. No theatrics, just a woman watching her fortress turn to dust around her. A military family advocacy group contacted me after news broke. "You're not alone," their email read. They asked me to speak webinar. Live Q at anything. I said no at first. I wasn't ready, but that phrase "not alone" lingered. I printed the email, folded it in my wallet. It wasn't vindication yet, but it was a shift. People knew, people cared, and for someone who'd felt like a ghost in his own life for months, that mattered more than justice. One evening, I got a call from another soldier, Sergeant Lopez. Same story: sudden divorce, drained finances, banishing spouse. They said, "You might talk to me." I listened for an hour, didn't interrupt. When he asked, "How did you survive it?" I said, "I didn't." Not all of me, but I told him what I knew, warned what to watch. He said thank you like it mattered. And somehow it did. Broken doesn't mean useless, just real. The jury deliberated for 2 days. I didn't attend every session, couldn't, but on the morning of the verdict, I stood outside the courthouse in uniform, not to sway opinion, just to stand visible, present, undeniable. Inside, I heard footsteps. Patel came out. "Guilty on all counts," she said. Jeremy, Daniel, and Becky each facing decades. I nodded, didn't speak, because sometimes silence says everything, and that morning, it spoke of gravity, of weight finally lifted. Wilson handed me a small box at the barracks. Inside, my wedding ring. Found it in storage. I stared at it, scratched, dulled, forgotten. I didn't put it on, didn't toss it either. Just held it. A relic. Not of her but of me, of who I was before betrayal, before courts, before silence. What now? Wilson asked. I didn't know, but I finally had the room to ask that question, and for once, the space to answer it. I visited the cabin in New Mexico now seized by the government. It stood quiet, surrounded by scrub and silence. I didn't go inside, just stood at the fence. Becky had built a future here, a false one made from stolen dreams. I left a folded paper on the gate, a copy of the divorce decree. Not for her, for me, a marker. Proof I made it through. Then I turned, boots crunching gravel, and walked away. Months later, I gave a quiet testimony to a Senate panel closed session. Lawmakers asked questions I answered not as a victim, but as evidence. Proof this happened, that it could again. What would you change? One asked. I said, believe us sooner. The room was still. Aide took notes. Afterward, Patel said, you did good. I nodded. Not for pride. Just because it was true. I'd stopped being silent. That mattered, even if it didn't fix everything. A new base counselor, fresh from grad school, asked if I'd ever consider mentoring. Guys listen to you, she said. I laughed and nodded her, but the thought of me, the wreckage, being someone's example. But later I said yes, once a month. No speeches, just presence. Sometimes that's all someone needs, to know they're not insane, not alone. We sat in silence some days. Other times, I told stories not about war, but survival. They listened. Patel sent a final case summary, over 50 pages. I read every line, names, charges, evidence. Then at the bottom, Nathan Briggs, key witness, initiator, survivor. I printed it, not for ego, just to remember. I tucked it beside the folded juror note. One line, 2 words, a lifeline, we see you. That validation, quiet, unsanctioned, meant more than any verdict. I was no longer invisible. Betrayed, yes, but not erased. That mattered more than revenge ever could. Wilson got orders, new base. We had a beer the night before he left. You goods, he asked. Same as always. I smiled. Getting there, he clapped my shoulder. No big speech. Just that. After he left, I stood in our shared space, quiet, still, no ghosts, just memory. Not all memories hurt. Some remind you who stood by you, even when it made no sense. Wilson did. And that loyalty stitched part of me back together. One morning, I passed a mirror and didn't flinch. First time in a while, I wasn't haunted, just older, smarter, worn, not broken. I'd stopped checking Becky's socials months ago, stopped searching court records. I didn't need updates. Justice had moved, and so had I. James called that afternoon. Why help with that expungement request? I paused. No, I said. Let it stand. Every scar tells a story. I earned mine. And I wasn't ashamed of surviving. Patel visited base once, months after sentencing. She handed me a folder, press release draft. We want to tell your story, anonymized, but real. I hesitated. Why now? Because silence helps them, she said. I read it twice, use it. I told her. It wouldn't undo the past, but it might prevent the next one. And if that meant reliving parts of it, fine. I wasn't just a soldier anymore. I was a warning, a line in the sand. A therapist once asked me, what do you miss most? I said, not thinking twice, trusting, loving, sleeping without checking locks. But I didn't cry, not anymore. That grief had passed through fire, come out tempered. I wasn't who I was before, but I wasn't stuck in him either. Recovery isn't rebirth, it's walking with limp and choosing the hill anyway, and I was climbing breath by breath, name by name, reclaiming every part they tried to steal. James mailed me a framed page, one section of trial transcripts, Becky's cross-examination. The moment she faltered, highlighted line, I don't recall 4 words, but they unraveled everything. I hung it above my desk. Not as revenge, as a reminder. Lies don't last, not forever. And for every hour I spent doubting myself, that frame whispered back, truth wins eventually. Even if it limps, even if it bleeds, even if no one claps when it crosses the line. I reconnected with my sister after years of silence. She'd cut ties during the chaos. Becky said I was unstable. She believed it for a time. We met at a diner halfway between cities. No blame, just coffee and cautious smiles. You okay? She asked. I nodded. Getting there, she squeezed my hand. Simple, steady, real. Rebuilding takes time, but bricks hold better when laid slow. That dinner wasn't a reunion. It was a reintroduction, and it held. Becky's sentence came 12 years. Federal, not maximum, but real. She didn't look at me in court. Didn't need to. I wasn't there for revenge, just closure. As the judge read charges, I looked at the flag above the bench. I'd fought under it, bled beside it. Betrayal happened in its shadow too. But today, it stood for something else. Boundaries, consequences, lines you don't cross. And for once, those lines held. That was enough for me. Daniel got 15 years, Jeremy 18, separate prisons, no appeals. James called it a clean win. I didn't argue, but win felt hollow. This wasn't a scoreboard. It was a wound tried by truth. At home, I folded the final report and filed it beside my discharge papers. Same shelf, different battles, both survived that night. I slept through till morning, no dreams, no calls, just rest first time in years, and I didn't take it for granted. An old neighbor from Fort Bliss emailed said she never liked Becky, always felt something off. I didn't respond, not from anger, just done. That part of my life didn't need rehashing, it needed distance. I archived the message, moved on because not every bruise needs a spotlight. Some heal best when left unprodded. Closure isn't dramatic. Sometimes it's quiet. A click, a sigh, a sunset no one else notices. But you do, and that's enough. I planted a tree behind the barracks. Nothing fancy, just a sapling from a base cleanup drive. No plaque, no speech, just dirt, sweat, roots. Murphy walked by, raised an eyebrow, symbolic. He joked, and I said, but maybe it was. Life grows, even in wreckage, even after betrayal, even when you doubt it ever will again. That tree, it wasn't for them, it was for me. For every version of me that never stopped standing. I sat on the edge of my cot, holding the old field journal I used in Kandahar. Pages were filled with routines, supplies, nothing personal until one entry: Becky made chili. Missed dinner, hearts loud tonight. I tore that page out, not from bitterness, but clarity. She was real in a moment. That moment passed, the journal still held. Still served, like me, Wilson said. We keep what works. I folded the page, burned it, kept the rest. James called it emotional residue, the static left behind after betrayal. I felt it brushing up in odd places: grocery aisles, email folders, a song on hold, music. But I didn't flinch anymore, didn't recoil, just acknowledged it, like a scar, present, but no longer dictating my step. I started swimming again, lap after lap, measured breath, no urgency, no flashbacks, just movement. That was healing, not magic, not sudden. Just quiet motion. James said, that's enough. At a vet center talk, someone asked if I'd ever trust again. I didn't dodge. Trust isn't a faucet, I said. It's a fuse. You light it, and you wait. Some fuses burn slow, some don't catch, but some they light again. I saw heads nod, not all, but enough. It wasn't a recovery seminar, just a room of people still walking, still burning maybe, but forward. That's what mattered. The fuse wasn't gone, just waiting for spark. I saw a couple arguing in the PS parking lot. She stormed off. He stood frozen, fists clenched. For a second, I saw myself, not in the anger, but the helplessness. I almost approached, didn't, and just watched. Sometimes survival isn't interfering, it's learning when not to repeat old mistakes. When I walked back to my truck, I didn't carry their pain. That was progress. A year ago, I'd have spiraled. Now I just drove, music low, window cracked. A trainee asked why I still wear my dog tags, even off duty. I said, because some parts of you deserve to stay visible, not shame, not wounds. But pieces that held. I kept one tag scratch, the one that went through every deployment, every betrayal. Not for fashion, for truth. That metal outlasted a marriage, a fraud ring, and my silence. So yeah, I wear it. Not to remember her, to remember me, the version that endured. A base chaplain asked if I'd forgiven Becky. I said no, then clarified forgiveness isn't required for survival. He nodded. It didn't argue. That surprised me, because most want neat arcs, clean lines, but pain isn't paperwork. It doesn't follow form. I wasn't angry anymore. That I didn't absolve her either. Some debts stay owed, some wounds scar permanent. And that's okay. I didn't need purity to find peace, just truth. And the truth was, I'd survived. That was enough. At a memorial wall, I traced names I once strained with. Some didn't make it back. Others came back changed. I added nothing, just stood there, silent, present, grateful, not because I was untouched, but because I was still standing. And maybe that's all this has ever been about. Not revenge, not closure, just momentum. Life doesn't wait for neat endings. It moves, and if you're lucky or stubborn, you move with it. I turned from the wall and breathed. Becky was moved to a low-security facility. The tele mailed, offering updates. I declined. Not out of mercy, out of choice. She was behind fences now. I wasn't. That was the only scoreboard that mattered. James called it maturity. I called it self-preservation. Her name no longer sparked rage, just absence, like a radio left on after the song ends. You don't notice until the silence feels lighter. And that silence, it finally belonged to me. Fully, finally. Mine. The advocacy group invited me to DF keynote speaker. I stood before a room of strangers, each carrying weight I understood. I told them not about betrayal, but rebuilding, not about fraud, but forward motion. I ended with one line: survival isn't passive. It's work. Applause came slow, then steady. No medals, no salutes, just nods, real ones. I stepped down lighter, not healed, but healing. And in that room, my story wasn't shame, it was structure. It stood. A base commander asked if I'd help rewrite spousal fraud protocols. Not policy experience, he said. I laughed. So I'm a case study now, a precedent, he corrected. I agreed. Not for recognition, for protection. If my fallout helped one soldier spot a red flag sooner, it was worth it. We met weekly, quiet work, policy drafts. But behind each clause was a scar. And those scars, they weren't weaknesses, they were maps. Proof we'd been there and built better. Murphy transferred bases again, sent me a postcard with 2 words still here. I pinned it beside the trial transcript. Didn't reply. Didn't need to. His presence didn't depend on proximity. That's the thing about trauma-born friendships, they stretch, hold, survive deployments, courts, and silences. Later, I sent him a care package. No letter, just a patched field cap, signed inside a "still here." That echo meant more than paragraphs ever could. We weren't done, just distant, and okay with it. I started running again, base perimeter. Before sunrise, same route I used to take before everything fell apart. This time, no headphones, just breath, gravel. Morning frost. Each step didn't erase pain, but it reclaimed ground, slowly, mile by mile. A junior officer joined once. We didn't talk, just ran. At the end he said, "See you tomorrow." I nodded, and I did, because sometimes rebuilding starts not with speeches but with steps. And I had more in me. My sister visited base first time since everything unraveled. We walked the grounds as she asked quiet questions. I gave quiet answers. Then she said, "I'm proud of you." I didn't deflect, just accepted. That was new. Pride used to feel distant, unreachable. Now it felt like standing still and letting someone see you without flinching. She hugged me before leaving. Not stiff, not formal, just full, honest. And for the first time in years, I didn't feel like an imposter. There's a bench near the base chapel. No plaque, no tribute, just quiet. I sit there sometimes, no schedule, let the quiet wrap around. Let memory pass through without demanding attention. That's peace, not absence of pain, but its soft edges. I don't look back as often. Don't brace for betrayal. Life still stings, but I meet it standing, because I survived something designed to erase me. And now I take up space, fully, freely, without apology. Finally whole. Thanks for watching. Hit subscribe to check out more stories on my channel.